Abducting Europa is an exhibition of video, docufiction and installation art on the theme of political fantasy from a moment when the future seems unwelcoming to many. Europe's contemporary political imaginary is permeated with metaphors of struggle, responding to global crisis by promoting ancient myths. New reactionary movements traffic in dreams of ethnic rebirth and exploit fears of an existential enemy at the gates of Fortress Europe, or even lurking within. Paradoxically, some of these very movements feel most at home in fringe online communities, which seems to provide a fertile soil for ideological radicalization and conspiracy theorizing to take root. Beneath the slick surfaces of social media platforms, it appears as though the political consensus of the 20th century is collapsing. Emerging from the wreckages are expressions of political collectivity that many considered relegated to the dustbin of history. Affording ever more radical expressions of tribal identity, social media platforms are now feeding the raw material of youth culture directly into the nationalist populist insurgency that is currently sweeping across the planet. The exhibition explores fringe internet culture, post-national symbolism, and various altered states of historical consciousness. The works weave together a network of autonomous aesthetic zones that recuperate the power of storytelling from movements preoccupied with an exclusionary image of the national past as a golden age. Abducting Europa is part of the new IMPAKT series, The Grand Narrative, which explores the productive potential of universalist narratives while deconstructing their troublesome presuppositions.
My video is made entirely of the text of Polish internet memes about people from Ukraine, which appeared under the hashtags like typical Ukrainian, monkey Ukrainian, the Ukrainian won't be my brother. And in recent years, Polish forums and Polish whole internet have been filled with these countless memes about two monkeys. One of them is proboscis monkey, the long-nosed monkey, and the other is bald uakari. And proboscis monkey is a disappearing species living in Borneo, and it has been the hero of the countless memes in which it appears as a typical Pole. And bald uakari is a small monkey living in Amazon forest, which as a meme has been transformed into this typical Ukrainian. And its blood-red face has become the face of a stereotype that it's really lively in Poland, the stereotype of constantly drunk Ukrainian. And when I was collecting materials for this project over a year ago, I remember an article that appeared briefly in the beginning of the 2019, and its headline read in different versions, but it was always very similar. A Ukrainian was walking backwards across the Polish border. And this article was about an illegal immigrant who tried to cross the green border between Ukraine and Poland, walking backwards, so that the footprints of his shoes would indicate that he was going from Poland to Ukraine, not from Ukraine to Poland. So I decided that the story about the Polish border, which is also, of course, the story about the border of the European Union, would become this visual representation of the collection of these internet memes that I've put together in the video. And it would in some way enable us to think and to reflect on those two directions of walking, of traveling, of East and West. I think the most important part of me thinking and what Europe means to me right now is that I think it kind of gives me this idea or this feeling of security in a way, because I am a part of LGBT community in Poland, and those last 2 years in Poland has been extremely difficult for us, and the life just became more and more difficult, and thus this idea of European Union and Europe is something that I think it's kind of very important for me, and this concept of human rights, this Western concept of human rights, it's also something that is very important to me on just a personal level, and and I think it's kind of important for me to have this feeling of security that comes with being part of European Union.
Well, Europe means a lot of things. It's mixed feelings. On one hand, it means the fact that I've been living in Europe for most of my time, and not only from my native country, Sweden, but I moved to Berlin after I graduated in 2000. And I could move to Berlin because of Europe or because of the European Union, that it was pretty easy to move around and not seek visas to work. And I lived also in US for many years, so I know the process of applying for visas, etc. So it means flexibility, of course, and freedom of movement. But then I'm also, of course, very aware of that it means only that for certain people, right?
Well, it's a place to live. Yeah, it's an area that occupies Earth that I live in. I mean, it's home. Yeah. But I'm neither against Europe or for Europe. I have a very neutral stance. I've lived in a lot of different countries growing up. I've been to like 14 different schools. So for me, I don't really have this like connection to any country or even any region in particular.
I think Europe is many things to me. It's where I live. I live in Germany, which is a part of Europe. I guess it's a political zone that I formally reside within, and that it's an idea in which I enact my daily life. And I guess it's also, to me, very much the European Union. So it's a political body of various different kinds. So I live within Germany, within the EU, but also within Schengen zone. So I guess it's an administrative space as well, and expression of a certain collective nationhood, supposedly. But I guess it also has a cultural implication, especially for somebody who grew up in New Zealand. There is, I guess, a particular idea of what Europeanness is from a New Zealand perspective, and from various different cultures and actors within New Zealand. So my family line can be connected to a wave of migration from Europe to from Europe to New Zealand, from Britain at the time. And in the 19th century. And that's a very ambivalent thing for me. Obviously, it's where I come from culturally in some ways, but I also see all of the difficulties that colonialism brings to New Zealand and to the world. So Europe as a cultural and political space is full of lots of challenges that I have a difficult time resolving myself. I see some of the effects of colonialism and European ways of, I guess, acting in business and in governance that I would push back on and that I would like to see changed. So Europe as an idea is also full of many things to question.
I might need to think a lot about what it really means to me. I think, first of all, it means the Enlightenment. I think that's the most important thing which connects me to Europe. On the other hand, it might have something to do in my mind with the idea of modernism, which I would say was born in Europe. It might have to do with the notion of progression. So maybe these three, and in spite of the fact that I'm to some extent I might be critical with the progression and even to some extent with the modernism. If we think about the Second World War and even the Holocaust, it is somehow it might be connected to the modernism. I think that these all three are quite important for me, and on the other hand, what I really appreciate in Europe is the individual, I wouldn't say freedom, but maybe self-determination, which I think is more or less a European value since the French Revolution. On the other hand, for sure, Europe also means colonialism. And I think that the issue of colonialism, it is a very important political issue right now from the perspective of the division of, let's say, Western and part of the Europe and, let's say, Eastern part of the Europe. And it's been even part of it is even part of the official political rhetorics in Hungary, this reference to the colonial past of Europe, which actually, like Viktor Orbán, for instance, doesn't want to share. So when in 2015 the refugee crisis took place and we had hundreds of thousands of refugees crossing Hungary, and there were these huge debates about what Hungary should do, Viktor Orbán somehow let everyone know that he considers this migration crisis as being a result of the colonialism. And as Hungary and these countries on the east, they didn't have anything to do with the colonialism, therefore it's not our problem, so Western Europe should somehow solve these.
For me, what is the most interesting part of Europe, if we think of Europe as part of the European Union, is not Europe, but the Union. I'm interested in this question: what does unionization mean? And what does unionization mean, not in the traditional sense, not necessarily in the traditional sense of the labor union, that has a particular, that relates also to a limited scale of membership. I'm very interested in the idea of what this model of unionization could mean on a transnational or on a planetary scale. What does it mean to build unions not only based on cultural categories, but on principles of transnational solidarity, redistribution, colonial reparation. And I feel that although the European Union has been deeply corrupted through its austerity doctrines on one hand and through its growing nationalist and racist tendencies on the other, I feel that in that promise, in that idea of unionization lies a fundamental opening towards the future, in a time in which we are dealing with crises that reach far beyond the traditional model of the nation state. We need to somehow be able to think on a planetary level without losing sense of what our site-specific place in the world is. Every one of us has a place-based understanding of the world, and related to that place-based understanding are ties to communities, to language, to cultural trajectories. These are extremely important, but I don't think these are the categories based on which a transnational unionization would necessarily build. I think a transnational union should function as in recognition of cultural specificity, in recognition of cultural history, should not attempt to mimic the kind of globalist atomization and generic implementation of capitalist culture across the world. It should recognize these specificities, and at the same time solidarize on, like, acts in a solidary manner on those questions that concern our common possibility for some form of meaningful survival, considering the ecological catastrophe that we are already finding ourselves in the middle of.
So this work of mine is called Europe, and it was recorded in 2012 in an island in Greece called Anafi. And I was invited with a group of international artists and dancers and curators and thinkers and writers to all gather at this island for 2 weeks, where we would somehow reflect about the political situation or the crisis in Europe. And Greece was in an economic crisis then, and we were basically reflecting about ways out, and how could we rethink, or how could we work together, and what is the future of art and artists working together. And this was also tied to a magazine called South Magazine, which later became the Documenta magazine. So, and that issue was called Arcadia. So that was sort of the whole topic. So I didn't know before I went there what I would do. So I brought, as I work mostly with moving images, I brought my camera and a few microphones, and the video that you see is very spontaneously recorded. So. And how I usually work is that have been working the last 10 years at least, or more even, is that I work in a very observational mode, and I document things, but then the documented footage is put together in a rhythmical montage, and I'm very interested also in the choreography and how images are working together. So I wouldn't call it a documentary, because it is also very much a subjective point of view from me. No. I feel just that it's something that grows out of fear, and the fear out of the other, and maybe lack of knowledge that you're part of the other. And I just look on this whole nationalistic movement as a very sad repetition of and just hoping that it will not have the same escalation and development as any other destructive hate for the other.
The first thought that came to my mind is that it's not happening, that it's not possible. But I think that is the answer that comes from emotion and not from like logic or something that will become analytical in my experience, in my work. But I think I'm not really, I think it would be very hard for me to answer this question from the level of analytical question of like art question, because every day I'm living in this national concept and this nationals happening every day and getting stronger, and I know what's the price. I know how this group and I know what's the price. I know there are many groups of people that need to be left over, that need to be just left behind for this concept to be growing. And it's just so hardcore sometimes, like so hardcore, so aggressive, that no, I might think my answer is no, like really strong no.
I think group narrative is important, and it's important to have stories. Stories are important. Stories that bond us to one another. And for example, mythologies, like myths, always point out similarities, like within the human condition. They're quite cathartic. But I don't think it has to be nationalistic. It can be humanist. You can create stories that are not tied to a specific region, but are tied to the general human condition, which exists regardless of one's cultural backgrounds. Like wanting to be loved, avoiding pain, wanting to be appreciated, and so on. This is something that, is universal.
Well, on the psychological level, for sure, because whoever believes in them, he or she feels redeemed through it, because it just strengthens the identity narrative. Otherwise, I believe that the nationalism it is pretty much outdated in such an interconnected world that we are living now, and especially in Europe, where, like, on a very small territory, many peoples are living, and many countries are not nation states. Some of them are. So I don't believe that the nationalism can be redeeming for either Europe or any of the nations which tries to separate themselves. So if it's a separatist one, I fully disagree with it.
In terms of nationalism, I think nationalism as a term always references to a regressive, mythical return to pasts that generally never existed in the first place, and that are then projected as our common futures. But the nation, the idea of the nation as something that describes a cultural category, of course, most certainly exists. And if we're thinking of new forms of planetary governance, these should not sidestep these cultural specificities. They should recognize, protect, and defend them.
Hi, my name is Simon Denny, and I'm an artist who was born and grew up in New Zealand, but I live in Berlin, in Germany. And the artwork I have on display here is called Ascent Above the Nation State Rule Sets. And it comes from a body of work that I made in 2017 for an exhibition in New Zealand, in Auckland, where I grew up, about the changing nature of the way New Zealand was being framed politically by, I guess, a set of international actors that are involved in technology businesses, and trying to contrast and map their ideological point of view with other points of view of how to see New Zealand and how to see global politics at the time. So all these works that I produced for this series, The Founder's Paradox was the name of the series, were based on board games. And I made sculptures which were display versions of these board games. And Ascent Above the Nation State was such a board game. And that sculpture is depicted actually in these canvases, these canvas prints. But essentially, it's a kind of blow up of a fictional rule set of this board game, Ascent. And the game is based on an existing game actually called Descent, quite a popular contemporary board game that was made in the last few years. But I kind of changed the narrative to show and emphasize, I guess, the politics of some of the actors I was looking at. And this particular game was also a bit of a collaboration. I also collaborated with a writer, and we were doing research on, I guess, the language around particular entrepreneurs and how they were framing their politics vis-a-vis the globe, but also, I guess, with a view to New Zealand. Because It kind of started with the founder of, or the co-founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, when he was in the media in New Zealand because he had property there. And there was a lot of speculation as to why he was interested in New Zealand, and a lot of discussion, public discussion about who he was and what he does. And I thought this was of particular geopolitical importance to New Zealand and New Zealand culture. And this is why I made these artworks. So this work is looking to, I guess, illustrate and unpack a little bit the culture around some of the political positions that
The piece you see here, it is entitled From Fake Mountains to Fate, and it is a research-based docufiction which I produced in 2016. And actually, it is a critical analysis of three of the major elements of the Hungarian state ideology called illiberal democracy. On one hand, it is about the symbolism of the ethnic landscape and political geography. That's the video on the left, which is entitled Amor's Geography. The second one, it is about the romantic historicism, historiography of national myths of origin. That's the video on the right, which is entitled The Rise of the Fallen Feather. And then in the middle, you see an installation, which is a kind of pseudo-museum of a fictitious archaeological find. And this one speaks mostly about Turanism as a re-emerging form of political religion. Initially, the piece, it is more extensive, so instead of 3 vitrines, which you see here, in the initial one there are 12 vitrines altogether, denoted by certain categories. In this case, you see the category of memory and exclusion, relics and ideology, which are the last 3 chapters actually of this part of the trilogy. And I think altogether the piece carries many references to the show Abducting Europe, because besides some specific Hungarian issues, which I consider though as case studies, so therefore starting from 2010, the developments that took place in Hungary actually seemingly spread all around the world. So in this particular case, I also discuss issues related to tribal identity, to the militarization of the education, and to how the mythical tales and the mythical narratives actually construct the basis for the national identity. And actually what I'm doing with this piece, it is that I'm creating a counter-narrative to the, let's say, official narrative of the actual Hungarian state. It depends on their usage. I think that in the majority of the cases it is a reactionary thing, for the same reason I already mentioned, that because they all refer to a kind of, in fact, non-existent golden age. So all the mythical renderings are trying to formulate that golden age, and that golden age in itself, it's an exclusivist nationalist position. So I couldn't really see any, let's say, sort of positive usage of mythological references again in the contemporary situations. For sure, it can be within a cultural debate or whatever. I think it makes a lot of sense, but not in the political discourses, I believe.
Coming from New Zealand, I'm aware of many different ways of understanding what a myth is from different cultural standpoints. So, you know, again, on the one side, I think from New Zealand, one is very familiar, I think also in the rest of the world, with the way that New Zealand has been marketed as some kind of version of the Lord of the Rings, which has a kind of mythical, ancient like basis to it, this kind of Tolkien British fantasy space, which has been very strongly articulated and even marketed alongside New Zealand identity. I think that is that is full of problems. I think that especially as the history of colonialism is so important to the way that New Zealand functions and the way it's framed, and all sorts of other things that go with that, relying on these kind of European myths and fantasies don't include many stories that are core to New Zealand, and they tend to obscure the violence and certain cultures altogether in their representation of that space. So I think that is really something to be problematic. Yet within my understanding of, for example, Maori culture, Indigenous New Zealand culture, there are, I guess, many forms of what might be referred to as like myths, and certainly stories, collective stories that are told about beings which are non-human and a kind of are outside of individual experience. And those, as far as I understand it, can tell very positive stories for those who they address. And indeed, collective storytelling is a big part of something that I see as very amazing in my understanding of what, for example, Indigenous Maori culture is. So I guess, yeah, it depends on where you're standing on the cultural spectrum. But I think generally, Western European myths in New Zealand are very suspiciously questioned, I would say.
I think what's interesting to me about myths is how little they have changed over time. Like, for example, like the monomyth, the hero journey, and so on. These are still narratives that form the backbone of a lot of Hollywood films. I think, and also in art house films, like you have a lot of references to Oedipus, like a lot of films that are inspired by Freud, who was also then inspired by, you know, ancient Greek myths. So I think it can be progressive because there's a lot of progressive art house cinema that is based on these myths. But I would say it's more like referential. But of course, like in the context of outright, those myths are used very differently.
I mean, that's an extremely interesting question because, of course, let's say the "Make America Great Again" slogan, the Trumpist slogan that mimics all of its variants, whether it is Modi in India or Duterte in the Philippines or Bolsonaro in Brazil. This mythological reconstruction of a great past that never existed in the first place, which is then projected as our common future. This is something that we see very strongly tied to reactionary, nationalist, racist, sexist, and homophobic forms of politics today, because it tends to reach back to a kind of original unity, often from a colonizer's perspective. So it also claims a kind of white indigeneity that never existed in the first place. These are of course deeply flawed and problematic. But myth and storytelling is of course always part of. It's also part of more progressive or emancipatory forms of politics, and it touches very strongly on the role of art and culture in mobilizing our common imagination. When we are fighting for alternate futures, I mean, these are somehow also myths. They are not there. They are stories that we tell each other, stories that mobilize, that agitate, that trigger our desire to act and change the world that we live in. But whether our acting in the world that we live in has anything to do with the world we say we want to realize, all of this remains one big open question. And and experiment. So in that sense, there's also there's myth making, there's storytelling, and these myths and stories are as real as we desire to act upon them. So in that sense, I wouldn't discard myth so easily.
Yeah, no, I think they can indeed help. I think that if we embrace the fact that most of our reality is based on myths, or the myth of the other and the myth of ourselves, we can maybe also make use of fiction and myths and ancient myths in order to look at ways out we could see this now with the corona crisis, right? Nobody thought that the machinery could stop, and suddenly it stopped. And I think that it's important to sometimes use myths or fictions to reinvent new ways of living.
God, I Just Want to Feel is an installation created specifically for Impact, and it's a combination of 3 works. Dear God, I Just Want to Feel, A Rose is a Rose, and You Are All I See. Together, they form an altarpiece to the imaginary. They all deal with topics of fantasy. For example, You Are All I See is a visual diary that plays out a love story between a voluntary celibate man and a string of fantasy women. The images together, they depict loneliness, isolation, and maladaptive daydreaming found within various online communities of men who prefer the company of fictional characters over real flesh and blood girlfriends. The images are not focused on any specific fantasy or any specific woman or specific man, but rather they're together an ode to the salience of the could be. The images are surreal and grimy, with collage layers that are peeling back to reveal failed, kitschy utopias that are hints of the real world. The images actually, despite looking very 3D generated, are not. The 3 photographs are very little retouching work has been done. They are photographs of real sets that I have built. The works are a result of a voyeur surveilling other voyeurs. It is a woman, me, looking at men, looking at fantastical representations of other women. There's a lot of mistrust, and people are no longer trusting any kind of institutions, whether they're cultural or if they're political. But at the same time, what I think is interesting is that there's still a lot of naivety left. So you don't trust you don't trust doctors, you don't trust the scientific establishment or the political establishment, but yet you're still naive enough to believe what a stranger says on the internet that doesn't have followers. So it's a weird combination of cynicism, disillusionment, and complete naivety.
I think I just see it, in the one hand, I see it as this like self-reinforcing loop that is happening, like this consent from the people in power, consent to emotions that increase these emotions in society, and which makes the people in power even more sure that then can fuel them, like they can tell them even more strongly or aggressively. So I think I see this as a kind of loop that is happening all over again. And but also but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's even the right or correct question. But that's something that I noticed from many people in Poland, that this feeling this feeling that the nation is getting aggressive, is getting much more aggressive and violent, and the politics are getting more aggressive and more violent, is making them just lose interest. It's just making them withdraw to some places of personal happiness or personal space in a way, and just make them resign from the participation at all. And that's something that is very scary for me. And I think it's even more scary because I actually was not, for the last 5 years or the last like maybe 8 years, I was not only active in artistic community and making art itself, but I was also active in activist community. And I see how much it gets tired, how much I get tired. It gets tiring a lot, and it just makes you like don't have, and it just makes you just don't have enough space in your body, in your brain, in your heart for it anymore sometimes. And I know it does it to me sometimes, and I'm pretty sure that it does it to a lot of younger generation in Poland.
The easy response in a way is people that reflect on the ties between contemporary youth culture and technology. But this, I think, but there's nothing new about that, because every generation has grown up with a different set of techniques, of technologies, and adapted their sensory mode and understanding of the world, their computation of the world through those tools. And that these tools develop doesn't make anything different about every generation readapting and reintegrating these into their own sensual modus operandi. What I would say is very important in terms of current youth movements is the environmental concerns, is the environmental mobilizations, the Fridays for Future and many other youth activist movements, because they are a generation that is marked by a great dying, by great loss, a generation that is becoming aware of what was and what they will no longer be able, they will be no longer be able to witness. So in that sense, it's also a generation that goes through a great trauma, that doesn't live the luxuries of our pasts, which, however complicated they might have been, still projected a kind of more or less durable idea of a future that would stably be waiting for us. And of course, now we are dealing with a generation whose very idea of the future has been undone. And what does it mean to be a futureless generation? At this moment, we see that it leads to great activism and mobilization in an attempt to create conditions for some kind of social or just futurity to exist or to remain, and this is the great struggle of our time. Will we live in a world with a future history, or not?
I think there's many youth cultures, or what young people are interested in, which is constantly changing and evolving in both of those spaces. So the space where I live and the space where I'm from. But I do see, of course, like certain subcultures which relate to the work that I'm showing at IMPAKT. There are many subcultures which proliferate internationally, both in Germany and in New Zealand online, and some are to do with articulating, right-wing fantasies about the world and what that looks like. And so I guess, I certainly interfaced in my research with spaces like 4chan and other online chat systems, which are kind of well known for being breeding grounds for often quite young people to project onto these kinds of stories and ideologies. So I guess that would be one thing that's relevant to me in the space of what young people are interested in, both in kind of more local, regional communities, which are then networked to local and regional communities around in other parts of the world.
In Hungary, the youth culture, I would say it is very much fragmented, and I have the feeling, as I'm kind of also teaching as an associate professor, so I'm in touch with many generations. I have the feeling that the new generations, the youth, actually today, it is apolitic. So they have various cultural preferences, but what unites them is that they are apolitic. This might also have to do with the late socialism in Hungary. So in Hungary, you wouldn't find any youth movement, as you find, let's say, in Russia, like the Nazi movement or the identitarian movement all around Europe, for instance. It doesn't really exist in Hungary. So I think from this point of view, Hungary might be an exception. All around Europe, if I'm kind of taking a closer look, actually maybe the identitarian movement is the strongest nowadays. There are for sure everywhere local differences. In Germany, I think like the tradition of Nazism is very strong, so you have a neo-Nazi, very strong actual neo-Nazi, I wouldn't even call it subculture. You have the hipster culture, which I don't know if you are familiar with the term. It's like the combination of hipster and Nazi, which is the kind of the new right kind of thing. But you have at the same time a very strong Antifa movement, which I had the experience. I had the chance to experience a few years ago. I spent longer time there. So it is various, but I would say across Europe, maybe the identitarian movement seems to be the strongest, and yeah, I'm very kind of suspicious and doubtful about that. But I think that's one of the strongest kind of youth culture, which can be called as a movement.
So this work is titled New Unions. New Unions is an artistic and political campaign that I started in 2016, beginning as a critique on the so-called Brexit dichotomy, the idea that the future of the European Union can only be defined through the so-called Leave and Remain campaign. And to me, it seemed there was something fundamentally wrong about this dichotomy, that on one hand, the Leave campaign, the campaign that was that wanted to step out of the European Union, the UK that wanted to step out of the European Union, cultivated a nationalist, nostalgic return to empire based on an anti-immigration agenda, a racist agenda. On the other hand, we have the Remain campaign that seems very neutral and reasonable, but it is very strongly tied to a bureaucratic financial austerity elite that has depleted countries like Italy, Portugal, Greece. And New Unions developed as a response to this dichotomy, asking the question, what would be third, fourth, fifth, sixth scenarios that identify this dualism, these two options for the future of the European Union, as equally wrong. So what would be a feminist union? What would be an ecological union? What would be a transcontinental union? Isn't the union the most interesting aspect of Europe, rather than this partially fictional cultural category through which we describe the continent? So in front of you, you see a map. This is the fourth version of the map that depicts, that visualizes all progressive transnational political parties that are active in the European continent at large today. It shows a map that is not defined by boundaries, but it's a map that is defined by these organizations themselves. They are the orienting points to navigate this map, this inverted map, this map that looks at the world from upside down, from inside out, also challenging the way that we have been approaching geographical territories that we have been depicting, mapping, controlling geographical territories up until the day of today. It's a map that challenges the very idea of what a map is or could be, and it asks a viewer, it asks a potential member of our campaign to start thinking of how a union between these particular political parties could lead to alternative forms of transnational unionization, that it could lead to this alternative scenarios from stateless unions to communal unions. Essentially, New Unions in that sense is a campaign for the imagination. It's a campaign for the imagination that tries to fight fictional false dualisms and dichotomies that keep our present hostage in order to enable the possibility of an emancipated future. The term populism, of course, is a little bit difficult because there are different readings. There are some that say populism is always tied to the right wing. There are people like Ernesto Laclau who argued that left forms of populism also exist, that it relates to the popular. In that sense, maybe it's easiest to make the kind of distinction between popular and populists. Popular in terms of for and by the people, populist as being extremely reductive in who the people is and who does not belong to that category, who is human enough to be part of the people, who is inhuman because of migration background, color of skin, religious orientation, whatever, to not be included into that category. I think us versus them dichotomy is very similar to the Leave Remain dichotomy of the Brexit referendum. They are also, they result from stories that we tell, from common narratives that we initiate. And what for me, art and culture is the field of myth making, of storytelling, of building imaginaries and morphologies that help us interpret or reinterpret or recompose the world that we live in, our past, but also our potential futures. So in a way, there's always this artistic, cultural, almost literary element to politics, because it relates to narrative, and narrative is a core component of any propagation of the world we exist in, or the world that we want to create. So yes, I think that art, politically engaged art, has a huge role to play in rethinking the narratives based on which we orient ourselves on the world, to challenge notions, myths and narratives like the ones that are focused on notions of private property, or the identity politics of the authoritarian right, the myth of white indigeneity, to deconstruct those, but also to tell new and different stories about planetary commons, about planetary unionization, about transnational parliaments, about utopian training camps, about experimental biospheres, to think the infrastructures and stories with which we world the world in a different way.
Tough question. I think that's a big ask for art to do. I think that the arts in general, and I guess kind of cultural expression made into different forms, can of course provide all sorts of compelling and moving cultural cues for people to invest in. And I think, you know, I guess as a consumer myself, and as a lover of art, fine art, but also music, so there's lots of things to look at which aren't, I guess, about polarizing us them. Yeah, but certainly this work that I'm showing you in Impact at the moment is about that. So my work in this case is definitely not something that does that. It maybe even identifies and kind of articulates some of what's problematic about divisive stories which don't include many visions of the world.
It definitely can formulate alternatives. The problem with these is that, like, unfortunately, I have the feeling that the art is just simply not powerful enough. It doesn't have the tools to have a stronger impact on, let's say, wider public. And for that reason, actually, anything formulated by any art product with this kind of, let's say, counter ideological content or whatever, they just cannot reach the level of the political propaganda, which is for sure, it might be differing in different countries. In Hungary, it is very strong. Generally speaking, I have the feeling that the art can generate significant change in a society, mostly through its, let's say, pedagogic sort of effect or through its pedagogic function. But it can express, or it can generate real changes only in certain situations. So when the things starts to already move to transform, and in that moment, if the art interferes with, for sure, not with, let's say, traditional forms, but rather untraditional forms like artistic activism or whatever, it can make a lot of difference. But if there is nothing, if the people are passive, if the whole kind of political discourse is like held by the power and there is no choice of an alternative voice, the art can do much less, I believe. It's much less powerful.
Yeah, I think art can. I think art can also not. I mean, art is not. Art is not only good or bad. Art can. But I do think that in art there is an experimental tradition, and there is a curiosity that makes people wanna explore new ways of being, or futures, or possibility for futures, and there is a long tradition of doing that. So maybe there is we could say that there is a hope that can be possible there.
I believe that art can be helpful in presenting emotions in a multi-layered way and not oversimplifying them. But I think it needs to create this intersectional front with the other spheres of activism, or with civic movement, human rights movement, and I don't think it will be able to do anything alone. I think art is not enough. Unfortunately for me, I would love to do just art, but I think that it can be a part, and it can be important part in this movement of many different people. But it needs to be not too egoistic in this to be a part of it, I think.